Kia ora, I'm Erin J. Doyle. Welcome to my channel and part 2 of my discussion about my poem Inheritance. If you haven't seen the previous video, that's where I've basically introduced the idea that I'm going to start sharing my published poetry and talking about them, inspirations, how I wrote them, blah blah. And then I've actually shared the poem itself, so I will link to that video here and in the description. So if you haven't seen that, go watch it and then hurry back for this half of the story, which is the blah blah. So, blah blah time. The poem Inheritance is, probably unsurprisingly, about my grandmother. I wrote it as being about your grandmother to make the story more intense and personal to the reader. Hearing about my grandmother doesn't necessarily affect you emotionally, but being told something about your grandmother makes it personal, makes it more emotional. So that was one of the very first things that I did in writing this poem, was switch from talking about my grandmother to that second person, your grandmother. My intention initially was to kind of tell the story of how it started through to how it ended. This is why I start the poem with your grandmother's illness was. Then I say later on it became, and then towards the end it remains. The idea here was to show the passage of time with her illness, from this starting as voices when she was a young girl through to how it remains. Even though she's gone, it's still sort of a presence in the memories of those of us who are descended from her. In the original draft, I put this idea of telling the story and the progression of the disease much more to the forefront, and as a result the poem was a bit telly. I even incorporated sections of dialogue, particularly around her forgetting that she married twice and forgot that she had granddaughters. Both of these ideas are from conversations that I've had with her. On one occasion, my mother very much in passing mentioned Doug, and my nana was like, "Who's Doug?" And we had to tell her that it was her second husband, and she had literally no idea what we were talking about. And she asked us about him. And that conversation, it wasn't heartbreaking. It was actually kind of funny because of her reaction. And then it was kind of, I guess, sad, not because of her reaction, because she didn't care that she had forgotten her husband, she didn't know, it didn't matter. But it was sad because of what we didn't tell her. She asked us what had happened to him, and my mother and I shared a kind of silent moment of communication and then lied to her about him, because the truth wasn't a nice thing. So I tried to tell that little anecdote in the poem. I used actual dialogue. I also did this with the forgetting who her grandchildren were. There was an incident where one of my sisters and I went to her on Mother's Day along with our mum, and she looked at us, you know, these two adult women standing in her house, no idea who we were, and she asked, "Oh, are you my grandchildren?" And we said yes, and there was this absolutely pure joy and pride and surprise on her face, and I wanted to put that into the poem, and I did, but ultimately ended up taking them out because the fragments of dialogue, whilst interesting and to me personal and emotive, broke the flow of the poem. They provided additional information, but they just broke up the flow of it and made it feel heavy and excessively long, keeping those ideas to their purest form of just, she forgot she had grandchildren, she forgot she had married twice, allows those ideas to exist in a very kind of simple and pure and kind of more emotive and powerful way than if they're over explained through the use of that, well, additional explanation, that dialogue, those descriptions of her reactions to being told the things that she had forgotten. In the first draft, I also had a lot more information to share in the final section where I talk about how her illness remains. I talked about an experience I had when I was speaking with another of her descendants about something completely unrelated to her, and I made a comment about accidentally lying. I may even actually have been referencing an episode of Family Guy where Brian randomly lies to a woman, and she asks him about it and he says, "I just lied to you and I don't know why." I think that's what I was talking about. And the family member that I was speaking to grabbed my hand and went pale and started shaking. And it was just this intense physical relief because she knew that her grandmother lied randomly about all kinds of things, and that lying was part of her illness. And she had spent her entire life worrying that every time she would sort of accidentally say something that wasn't 100% true, worrying that maybe that was a symptom. And again, I tried to capture that experience in the poem. I tried to explain the intensity of the relief. But in doing so, again, it ended up too heavy. The additional explanation didn't add to the emotion of the piece, it actually took away from it. So most of this poem is sort of under-described. There is so much more going into each sentence or stanza, line, than is sort of on the page. I think in doing so, it retains that poetic rhythm and it allows each idea in its simplicity to really sink into your mind as you're reading it, rather than being distracted by additional flowery language or description. By not explaining things, I've allowed the reader to potentially exaggerate them on their own. In the stanza where I talk about my grandmother's occasional violence, I say she chased her daughter with an axe. I don't tell you that someone intervened and that her daughter was fine, physically. And the same with throwing her baby on a bonfire. That happened, but someone caught the baby. I don't tell you that her baby has a fear of fire even into her 70s. And then I say a string of kittens that never became cats. This references something that someone said to me just in passing, that my grandmother, who once bred cats for show, stopped having cats because they stopped living to be cats. In my first draft, I took it to a writing group and I asked if perhaps the fact that I had mentioned cats after discussing human infants was maybe misleading, and if I should explain that I was meaning literal cats. And I was told not to, and I think this was really good advice. Whilst I was actually talking about kittens, there's this possibility that I'm not, particularly where it's coupled with these two incidents with actual children. There's an opportunity for the reader to exaggerate the horror of that statement. In the opening stanza, I mention an uncle dying tied to his bed. This wasn't actually my mother's uncle, but I was aware that somewhere in the family tree there was an Isaac who died in an asylum tied to his bed. I have read his medical records, so I knew the situation he was in when he died, you know, details of his bed sores, and I had read a description of his delusions as he shared them with his doctor, psychiatrist, person. And there was a line in his medical notes which always struck me as just random and heartless and unnecessary. After this lengthy description of his delusions and the physical state he was in at the time of his death, the final line of his medical records is simply very stupid. I included that line in the first draft of the poem. I said that he died tied to his bed. Very stupid, his medical records read, or something like that. I can't actually find the original draft, I'm going by memory here. I took this out because having bed and read so close together created the suggestion that the poem would have a rhyming scheme, which it didn't. A single rhyme within a whole non-rhyming poem felt like a mistake in terms of rhythm and style, so it had to go. But I feel like the change fails to communicate how horrific asylums would have been during that period, but it also wasn't really the point of the poem, so I felt like removing that little detail didn't harm the poem in any way. It just improved the sort of structural integrity of the piece. That being said, I did get a few quite positive comments about that line when I initially workshopped the poem, because of it being a historical reference, which is always so interesting. But ultimately I felt that that one-off rhyme within a non-rhyming poem was inappropriate for the structure. It's probably not clear in the video clip that I uploaded, but when I wrote the poem, the final line of "it's hereditary" was a stanza all of its own. I did this so there was a significant break between that idea and the ideas of the previous stanza, but also because a single standalone statement of just 2 words made it bigger. I find that if you want to create emphasis in a piece, if you want a word to really stand out, the best thing you can do is to drop it to the next line, put in a break, make it the beginning of something, or the very, very end of something, but standing alone. So that's how I created additional emphasis when I had the poem written out. Which is why when I made it into a video thing, I moved that line to the center of the screen and included a slightly greater pause between it and the previous lines than had been being used throughout the poem to create that slight pause to increase the emphasis. I don't know if that came across. Let me know down below if it worked or not. And finally the title, Inheritance. I guess fairly obvious why I picked that title. It's a poem about something that runs in the family, something that I could inherit, something I don't want. So I felt that that title was appropriate, and a one-word title is something that I do fairly often. It's not necessarily a blanket rule within my writing, but a lot of my poetry has just a single word as a title. So it kind of fitted in well with my existing works. I'm pretty sure that's all I have to say about Inheritance. It is a fairly simple and to the point poem, but hopefully it's more impactful because of that. If you have any questions or thoughts about this poem or my general explanation of it, do leave them in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. If you enjoyed this video, do give it a like. It helps the algorithm tell people that my stuff is worth watching. If you're new around here, maybe consider hitting subscribe and ringing that bell so you can stay up to date, and I'll see you next time. Bye! So that's everything I have to say. Whoops! Attacking my tripod. We won't do that.